The iron key turned in the monastery crypt door at 11:47 p.m., echoing through stone corridors where no woman was meant to walk. Two figures in black habits descended into darkness that smelled of incense and decay, their footsteps muffled by centuries of dust that coated flagstones cold enough to numb bare feet. This is the story of how Sister Catherine and Sister Margaret transformed their prison into an execution chamber, using nothing more than holy ground and unholy patience. The convent of St. Mary's sat on a limestone bluff overlooking the Kentucky River, where morning mist rose like prayers seeking heaven. Built in 1803 by French missionaries, the stone walls stood 3 feet thick, designed to keep the world out and the devoted in. But for Catherine and Margaret Hartwell, those walls had become something else entirely, a trap baited with their own lives. The sisters hadn't chosen religious life. Their father, Judge Cornelius Hartwell, had delivered them to St. Mary's on a cold February morning in 1806, payment for debts that went deeper than money. The girls, then 22 and 24, had stood in the convent parlor, while Mother Superior Benedictine counted gold coins like they were purchasing livestock. "They'll serve God now," Judge Hartwell had declared, avoiding his daughter's eyes. Better than the alternative being scandal. Catherine had been caught in passionate correspondence with a married man. Margaret had refused 3 advantageous marriage proposals, displaying what their father called unnatural independence. In 1807 Kentucky, such behaviors demanded correction. The convent provided it. But Judge Hartwell had miscalculated one crucial detail. He'd sent both daughters to the same prison, allowing them to nurture their rage together like tending a carefully banked fire. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in church records for over 2 centuries. Mother Superior Benedictine ruled St. Mary's with the authority of someone who'd forgotten what mercy felt like, a Belgian woman in her 60s. She'd arrived in Kentucky fleeing Napoleon's wars, bringing old-world discipline to frontier spirituality. Her office smelled of lavender, water, and disappointment, lined with ledgers that recorded every transgression, every penance, every moment of imperfection among her charges. The Hartwell sisters learned quickly that survival meant invisibility. They attended prayers at dawn, worked in the garden until midday, copied scripture until evening, and slept on straw mattresses in cells barely wider than coffins. But invisibility also created opportunity. In the scriptorium, while copying passages about divine justice, Margaret developed a different skill: forgery. Her careful hand could replicate Mother Superior's writing with precision that would fool angels. Catherine, assigned to the herb garden, began studying plants with purposes beyond seasoning. Foxglove for heart ailments, nightshade for sleep disorders, monkshood for pain relief. Knowledge accumulated like rainwater in cisterns. The monastery's visiting priest, Father Antoine Dubois, arrived monthly to hear confessions and conduct special masses. A corpulent man in his 50s, with hands that lingered too long during benedictions, he developed particular interest in the Hartwell sisters. His confessional booth became a place where penance took forms that had nothing to do with Hail Marys. Catherine emerged from her first confession with torn fabric and eyes that held new darkness. Margaret's session the following month left finger-shaped bruises on her wrists, hidden beneath long sleeves. When they tried reporting Father Dubois to Mother Superior, they were assigned additional prayers for their lustful imaginations. Silence became their sanctuary. From the convent records, March 15, 1807, the Hartwell sisters display troubling attachment to one another, recommend separation to different orders for spiritual health. But separation never came. Perhaps Mother Superior found their presence useful, 2 educated women who could teach the younger novices. Perhaps she simply forgot, overwhelmed by managing 37 women living behind walls that grew higher with each passing season. The sisters used that oversight to their advantage. They developed a language of glances, a vocabulary of shared memories that needed no words. When Father Dubois arrived for his April visit, they were ready with something more than prayers. But what does justice look like when the law protects the predator and condemns the prey? The answer waited in the monastery crypt, where stone walls absorbed screams like they absorbed prayers. The plan required 3 more months of meticulous preparation, timing that would coincide with Father Dubois' most vulnerable moment. Margaret's fingers traced the edge of a foxglove leaf, while morning dew still clung to its purple bells. The monastery garden stretched 30 yards square, enclosed by walls that trapped both sunlight and secrets, where rows of medicinal plants grew under the watchful eyes of sisters who'd learned to see salvation in soil. The sisters had discovered that knowledge, like poison, worked best when administered in careful doses over time. Father Dubois maintained a predictable schedule during his monthly visits. Morning Mass at 7, private meetings with Mother Superior until noon, individual confessions from 2 until 6, evening prayers, then retirement to the guest quarters, where he'd drink communion wine until sleep claimed him. The pattern had held for 18 months, reliable as sunrise, vulnerable as candle flame. Catherine knelt between rows of monkshood, its blue flowers deceptively beautiful in the late spring sunshine. She'd spent weeks researching the plant's properties in the monastery's medical texts, volumes donated by a physician who'd believed knowledge should serve God's work. The books described monkshood's uses for treating pain, but they also detailed its darker applications. The line between medicine and murder often measured thinner than a communion wafer. In the scriptorium, Margaret perfected her most crucial forgery yet. Mother Superior's signature on a letter requesting Father Dubois inspect the monastery's relic collection stored in the crypt. The letter explained that recent heavy rains had raised concerns about water damage to the sacred artifacts, and his expertise was needed to assess their condition. The inspection would require privacy, as disturbing the relics during regular hours might upset the younger sisters. The beauty of the plan lay in its religious necessity. Who would question a priest's duty to preserve holy objects? But the sisters faced a problem that threatened everything. Sister Agatha, the monastery's record keeper, had begun noticing discrepancies in the herb garden's inventory. Plants harvested, but not accounted for in the infirmary's medical logs. Margaret's careful forgeries couldn't explain away missing monkshood, foxglove, and nightshade without raising questions that led to investigations. They needed a scapegoat. Sister Bernadette, 19 years old and perpetually confused, had arrived at St. Mary's 3 months earlier, after her family discovered her talking to invisible companions. The girl spent hours in the garden, mumbling to plants she claimed spoke back to her. Her behavior had already marked her as unstable in Mother Superior's estimation. One more transgression would justify her removal to an asylum, where questions died in cells padded with straw and silence. The sisters felt no guilt about sacrificing Bernadette's fragile sanity. Survival demanded compromise, and they'd learned to measure conscience against necessity. From the personal journal of Sister Catherine, found years later, God tests us with choices between lesser and greater evils. We choose the lesser. Praying forgiveness finds us worthy, despite our methods. On June 20th, Margaret placed foxglove leaves in Bernadette's herb basket while the girl knelt in prayer. That evening, Sister Agatha discovered the theft. Mother Superior's punishment was swift. Bernadette would spend 1 week in solitary prayer, confined to her cell with only bread and water. After that, arrangements would be made for her transfer to more appropriate care. The girl's confused protests echoed through stone corridors where other sisters pretended not to hear. Some genuinely believed Bernadette guilty. Others suspected the truth, but chose silence over investigation. What would you have done, watching an innocent punished for crimes you witnessed being committed by others? Would you have spoken up, knowing your words would destroy carefully laid plans for justice? Or would you have closed your ears like a tomb, letting guilt bury itself in silence. With Bernadette removed and herb inventory explained, the sisters finalized their preparations. Margaret's forged letter reached Father Dubois on June 22nd, requesting his presence for the relic inspection on June 25th. His response arrived promptly, expressing eagerness to serve the monastery's sacred needs. He had no idea he was accepting an invitation to his own judgment. The monastery crypt waited beneath the main chapel, accessible through a narrow staircase hidden behind the altar. Stone walls sweated moisture even in summer, creating an atmosphere that preserved both relics and secrets. Ancient bones rested in niches carved from limestone, while wooden boxes contained fragments of saints whose names had been forgotten by everyone except God. Perfect acoustics for screams that no one would hear. The communion wine tasted sweeter than usual that June evening, though Father Dubois couldn't identify why. Catherine had added honey to mask the bitter herbs that would ensure his deep sleep, while Margaret prepared the crypt for their midnight appointment with divine justice. The priest's monthly visits had become an ordeal that 37 women endured in terrified silence, each knowing her turn might come next. Father Dubois finished his evening prayers at 9:45, blessing sisters who kept their eyes downcast and their thoughts hidden behind layers of practiced humility. His chambers in the guest quarters smelled of beeswax and brandy, furnished with comforts that reminded him of his authority even in this frontier wilderness. A feather bed, imported wine, books bound in leather that cost more than most families earned in a year. The drugged wine worked quickly. By 10:30, his snores echoed through walls thin enough to hear coins dropping in collection plates. Margaret waited until 11 before slipping into his room, keyring lifted from his belt with fingers trained by necessity. His breathing remained deep and steady as she tested each key against the crypt door 2 floors below. The third key fit perfectly. Catherine had spent the afternoon arranging the crypt for maximum psychological impact. Candles placed to cast shadows that moved like living things, ropes positioned where they'd be needed, tools borrowed from the monastery's workshop, implements that served God's work above ground, but would serve different purposes below. The monastery's relic collection included fragments that told stories of martyrdom, saints who died for their faith under Roman persecution. Saint Agatha, whose breasts were torn off with iron tongs. Saint Lawrence, roasted alive on a gridiron. Saint Bartholomew, flayed alive with knives. The sisters had studied these accounts not for inspiration, but for methodology. History provided the template. Father Dubois woke at 11:53, head thick with artificial sleep, bladder pressing from the evening's wine consumption. He stumbled toward his chamber pot, but found a note slipped under his door instead. Mother Superior's handwriting, urgent and apologetic. A water leak in the crypt threatened the relic collection. His immediate inspection was required to prevent irreparable damage to sacred artifacts. The priest dressed quickly, his movements still sluggish from Catherine's herbal enhancement. Religious duty overcame personal comfort, as the sisters had calculated. He'd rather lose sleep than explain to his bishop how negligence had destroyed irreplaceable holy objects. The crypt key worked smoothly in his practiced hands. Stone steps descended into darkness that seemed to swallow his candlelight, while moisture-heavy air carried sense of age and sanctity. He called out, expecting to find Mother Superior, waiting with details about the supposed leak. Instead, he found 2 figures in black habits standing beside St. Bartholomew's reliquary. Sisters. His voice echoed off stone walls, designed to amplify prayers. What are you doing here? Where is Mother Superior? Catherine stepped forward, her face pale in the candlelight, but her voice steady as scripture reading. We're here for confession, Father. Private confession that requires absolute discretion. Margaret moved behind him, blocking the staircase with casual precision. The crypt door swung shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing. The key turned in the lock, sealing them in sacred space where God's justice would finally be served. This is highly irregular, Father Dubois protested, though his voice carried uncertainty now. The wine's lingering effects made thinking difficult, while the enclosed space created intimacy that felt suddenly dangerous. Confessions are conducted in the proper booth, during designated hours. Some sins require special accommodation, Catherine replied, producing rope from behind St. Agatha's shrine. Sins that have been hidden too long in darkness. Sacred ground holds many secrets. The priest's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as understanding penetrated his drugged consciousness. He reached for the crypt door, finding it locked, key missing from his belt. His breathing quickened, echoing off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of prayer and now would witness something else entirely. Margaret lit additional candles, revealing tools arranged with ceremonial precision. Rope that had secured hay bales now would secure flesh. Knives that had carved turnips now would carve different lessons. The monastery's everyday implements transformed into instruments of divine retribution. "What do you want?" Father Dubois asked, though his voice suggested he already knew the answer. The sisters had spent months planning their response to that question, crafting words that would carry the weight of 18 months' accumulated rage and violated trust. The rope cut into Father Dubois's wrists as Margaret secured him to the stone pillar where Saint Sebastian's arrows had once rested. His protests echoed off walls that had heard centuries of prayers, but now witnessed the kind of justice that canonical law never addressed. Two women who'd been taught submission their entire lives finally found their voices in the place where God kept his deepest secrets. Catherine placed a kitchen knife against the priest's throat, its blade reflecting candlelight like trapped starfire. "You want to hear our confession, Father? Let us confess what you did to us in that booth upstairs. How your hands wandered during penance. How your version of absolution required our silence and our bodies." The priest's eyes darted between the sisters' faces, searching for mercy he'd never shown them. "This is madness. You're women of God. This violence goes against everything you've sworn to uphold." "Violence?" Margaret laughed, the sound bitter as communion wine left too long in chalices. "You mean like forcing yourself on women who came seeking spiritual guidance? You mean like using your authority to take what was never offered?" Father Dubois struggled against the ropes, but Margaret had learned knot tying from the monastery's stable master, a man who understood that some things needed to stay exactly where you put them. The priest's movements only tightened his bonds, rope biting deeper into flesh that had grown soft from years of comfort and corruption. The crypt's atmosphere intensified their psychological assault. Surrounded by the bones of martyrs, Father Dubois faced judgment from women he'd reduced to objects of his desire. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine, who'd spent months copying scripture about divine justice while planning this very scene. "We tried reporting you," Catherine continued, her voice steady as reading evening prayers. "Mother Superior called us liars, said our accusations came from lustful imaginations that needed correction through additional prayer and fasting. So we prayed. Father, we prayed for guidance." She pressed the knife's edge against his skin, drawing a thin line of blood that looked black in the candlelight. And God answered. From the monastery's medical records, found decades later, Father Dubois displayed increasing agitation during final visit, complained of chest pains and difficulty breathing, recommended rest and reduced wine consumption. Margaret produced a vial of clear liquid, holding it where the priest could see. Foxglove extract. Sufficient quantity to stop a man's heart, but administered slowly enough to ensure consciousness throughout the process. We learned medicine caring for sick sisters. Now we practice it for justice. The liquid caught candlelight like captured tears, each drop representing hours of careful preparation in the herb garden, where Catherine had distilled leaves into concentrated vengeance. Foxglove grew wild throughout Kentucky, but few understood its precise applications. The monastery's medical texts had provided education that their teachers never intended. Father Dubois' breathing quickened as understanding penetrated fear. "You can't do this. I'm a man of God. Killing me is mortal sin that will damn your souls for eternity." "Our souls were damned the moment we let you touch us without fighting back," Catherine replied. "This isn't about salvation anymore. This is about ensuring you never touch another woman again." She lifted the vial to his lips, but hesitated. The moment of actual violence required crossing a line that separated victim from perpetrator, and even justified rage struggled against lifelong conditioning toward mercy and forgiveness. Margaret sensed her sister's conflict and stepped forward. "Remember Sarah," she whispered, "the novice who left suddenly last month. Remember why she really disappeared?" Sarah had been 16, barely old enough to understand what Father Dubois demanded during her first confession. Her departure had been explained as a family emergency, but the sisters knew better. They'd found her blood-stained undergarments hidden in the laundry, evidence of violence that Mother Superior had ordered burned rather than investigated. The reminder hardened Catherine's resolve. She forced the vial between Father Dubois's lips, pouring liquid death down his throat while he struggled against bonds that held firm as his conviction to silence his victims had been. But what happened next would transform their planned execution into something far more complex and terrifying than simple poisoning. The foxglove began its work immediately, but slowly enough to allow for extended confession. Father Dubois' heart began skipping beats at 12:37 a.m., irregular rhythms that matched the stuttering candle flames, casting shadows across stone walls carved with saints' names. His face flushed crimson, then drained to the color of communion wafers, while sweat beaded on skin that had never known honest labor. The sisters had calculated dosage precisely, ensuring consciousness would linger long enough for complete confession of 18 months' worth of violations. "Tell us about Sister Marie," Catherine demanded, holding a second vial where the dying priest could see it. "The one who left in January. What did you do to her during her private retreat?" Father Dubois's voice came in gasps. Each word fought from lungs that labored against the foxglove's steady assault on his cardiovascular system. "I don't. What are you talking about?" "Sister Marie requested transfer to the mission in Louisiana." Margaret produced a letter from her habit, unfolding paper that crackled like dry bones in the crypt's humid atmosphere. Her real letter, the one Mother Superior hid. She described what you did during her spiritual counseling sessions, how you convinced her that physical submission was part of divine obedience. The priest's eyes widened as recognition flickered across features distorted by poison and panic. Marie had been 18, devout enough to believe that suffering was virtue, innocent enough to trust that a priest's demands carried God's authority. Her letter detailed violations that had left her pregnant, then arrangements for her quiet removal before scandal could damage the monastery's reputation. She wanted it. Father Dubois wheezed, still attempting manipulation, even as death tightened its grip around his throat. Young women get confused about their desires. I was helping her understand the difference between holy love and earthly lust. Catherine's knife found his cheek, opening a line that wept blood into his graying beard. "Holy love? Is that what you called it when you forced yourself on her during confession? When you told her that resistance was Satan trying to corrupt her soul?" The foxglove was working methodically, shutting down the priest's heart muscle fiber by fiber. His breathing grew shallow, pupils dilated despite the bright candlelight, hands trembling against ropes that had rubbed his wrists raw. But consciousness remained, trapped in a failing body that couldn't escape the consequences of 18 months' worth of predatory behavior. From the hidden correspondence of Mother Superior Benedictine, Father Dubois' needs must be managed discreetly. The young ones learn faster when correction comes from religious authority. 3 pregnancies this year represent unfortunate but necessary education in feminine duty. Margaret read excerpts from the letter aloud, her voice echoing off stone walls where generations of faithful had prayed for divine justice. Each revelation struck the dying priest like physical blows, his face contorting with expressions that mixed pain with dawning recognition of complete exposure. "You knew," he gasped, looking between the sisters with eyes that bulged from oxygen deprivation. "You've known all along about the others." "We've known about 12 victims over 3 years," Catherine confirmed, her voice carrying the authority of careful documentation. "Novices who disappeared suddenly, sisters transferred to distant missions, young women who arrived faithful and left broken, if they left at all." The crypt's temperature seemed to drop as the sisters revealed the full scope of their investigation. They'd spent months cataloging Father Dubois' pattern of abuse, tracking victims through correspondence hidden in religious texts, building a case that would never see legal court but would receive ultimate judgment in this underground tribunal. Margaret lit additional candles, revealing alcoves where more tools waited. Not instruments of quick death, but implements designed for extended persuasion. The sisters had studied accounts of medieval interrogation, learning techniques that extracted truth through carefully applied pressure. "Sarah didn't leave because of family emergency," Margaret continued, producing another letter. "She left because you got her pregnant, then arranged her abortion through that traveling doctor who asks no questions about young women's medical needs." Father Dubois' confession came in broken segments, each admission dragged from lungs that barely functioned as the foxglove completed its methodical destruction. Names, dates, methods of coercion, locations where violations occurred. The sacred confessional booth became a crime scene. The wine cellar where he stored personal supplies became a site of assault. Even the altar where he celebrated Mass became a place where power corrupted holy purpose. But the sisters had planned for more than confession. They'd planned for justice that extended beyond one man's death, reaching into the system that had protected him while silencing his victims. As Father Dubois' breathing grew more labored, Catherine produced a final document that would ensure his crimes lived beyond his corpse. The quill trembled in Father Dubois' weakening grip as Margaret guided his hand across parchment that would serve as his final sacrament. Each letter carved truth from a man who'd spent 3 years hiding behind clerical authority, while Foxglove completed its systematic destruction of the heart that had pumped corruption through his body. The forced confession detailed every violation with legal precision, creating evidence that would outlive all 3 people locked in this underground tomb. "Sign it," Catherine commanded, steadying his failing hand against the stone ledge, where saints' relics had once offered comfort to the faithful. "Every word, every name, every violation you committed while wearing God's robes." The document stretched across multiple pages, written in Latin, that would be understood by church authorities, but untranslatable by local law enforcement who might question its contents. Margaret's classical education, forced upon her by a father who valued cultured daughters as marriage assets, now served darker purposes in crafting legal testimony that would destroy Father Dubois' reputation posthumously. His signature came in broken strokes, each letter fighting through tremors that marked Foxglove's final assault on his nervous system. Blood from his self-inflicted wounds dotted the parchment like unholy water, blessing a document that transformed victim testimony into official church record. "The bishop," Father Dubois whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own labored breathing. "He knew about the others. Said frontier parishes require different disciplines." Margaret exchanged glances with Catherine, both understanding the implications. Father Dubois wasn't an isolated predator, but part of a system that protected abusers by transferring them between remote parishes where oversight remained minimal and victims lacked powerful advocates. The monastery's location, days' travel from major settlements, had been chosen specifically for its isolation, perfect hunting ground for wolves in shepherd's clothing. Catherine produced sealing wax and the monastery's official stamp, tools that would give the confession legal weight in church courts where secular law held no jurisdiction. The wax melted over candle flame that cast dancing shadows across stone walls, carved with names of martyrs who died for their faith. while 3 people completed a ritual that had nothing to do with sanctity. "Where should we send this testimony?" Margaret asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "The bishop who protected you? The Vatican officials who profit from frontier corruption? Or perhaps someone with actual interest in justice?" Father Dubois' eyes rolled back as the foxglove reached his brain, but enough consciousness remained for him to understand the question's implications. The sisters weren't just killing him. They were destroying the network that had enabled his crimes while ensuring their testimony reached reformers who might actually act on the information. From the personal effects of Bishop Lawrence Morrison, found after his death, Father Dubois serves frontier needs efficiently. Young women in isolated parishes require firm guidance that Eastern sensibilities might misunderstand. His methods produce compliant wives for colonial expansion. The sealed confession went into a leather pouch that Margaret had prepared months earlier, addressed to reformist priests in Philadelphia who'd begun questioning frontier church practices. Along with Father Dubois's testimony, the package included copies of correspondence between Bishop Morrison and other church officials, documents stolen during the bishop's last inspection visit when Catherine had volunteered to clean his chambers, evidence that would expose systemic corruption extending far beyond one Kentucky monastery. But as Father Dubois' breathing grew increasingly shallow, the sisters faced a problem they hadn't fully anticipated. How do you dispose of a dead priest in a religious community where his sudden disappearance would trigger investigation by both church and secular authorities? The solution lay in the monastery's own burial practices. St. Mary's maintained its own cemetery, where deceased sisters were interred in simple graves marked only with wooden crosses. Recent heavy rains had opened sinkholes in the limestone foundation, creating natural burial sites that could be explained as accidents if anyone asked troublesome questions. Margaret checked Father Dubois's pulse, finding only irregular flutter that would stop completely within minutes. His face had turned the grayish-blue color of someone drowning in their own failing circulation, while his eyes stared at nothing with the glassy expression of approaching death. "It's finished," she whispered, though whether referring to his life or their revenge remained deliberately ambiguous. Catherine blew out half the candles, reducing visibility in the crypt to levels that would hide details while they moved the body. The priest's corpse would rest temporarily among the saint's relics, a final irony in a story built from contradictions between sacred appearance and profane reality. But their work had only begun. Dead priests require explanations, and the sisters had spent months crafting a story that would satisfy investigation while protecting their own involvement. The monastery bells chimed 6 times for morning prayers, their bronze voices carrying across limestone walls where 35 women knelt and practiced devotion, while 2 others finished arranging evidence that would transform murder into miraculous accident. Father Dubois' body lay hidden in the crypt's deepest recess, positioned among saints' bones where searchers would find him only after following carefully planted clues. The sisters had discovered that successfully hiding truth required revealing selective portions of it, like controlling how much light enters a room by positioning candles with deliberate precision. Catherine emerged from the crypt during morning prayers, slipping into her regular place beside the other sisters with movements practiced enough to avoid attention. Her hands showed no blood, her breathing remained steady, and her expression carried the same serene devotion she displayed for 18 months of planning this moment. Margaret had remained below, arranging the scene with theatrical precision that would support their fabricated narrative. Father Dubois had died of heart failure while conducting his requested inspection of the relic collection. The wet limestone had proved treacherous, causing him to fall and strike his head before the cardiac episode claimed him. Tragic, but believable, especially given his age and documented fondness for rich food and strong drink. Mother Superior Benedictine noticed Father Dubois' absence when he failed to appear for morning mass at 7. Her knock at his guest quarters brought no response, though the door remained locked from inside. By 8, her concern had escalated to alarm. By 9, she'd ordered sisters to search the monastery grounds while she examined his chambers for clues about his disappearance. Sister Catherine, Mother Superior, called during the search. "You work in the herb garden. Have you seen Father Dubois this morning? He expressed interest in our medicinal plants during yesterday's discussion." Catherine's response came with perfectly calibrated worry. "No, Mother Superior. Though I heard footsteps near the chapel very late last night, I assumed he was conducting private prayers for this morning's special Mass." The lie contained enough truth to satisfy casual investigation, while directing attention toward the chapel and its adjoining crypt. Other sisters reported similar half-truths: sounds of movement during night hours, concerns about the priest's health, observations about his increasing interest in the monastery's architectural features. Each testimony added brushstrokes to a portrait of a dedicated priest whose spiritual devotion had led him into danger. Sister Agatha found the crypt door unlocked at 10:43, her lamp revealing stone steps that descended into darkness, where Father Dubois had met his carefully orchestrated fate. Her scream echoed through corridors designed to amplify prayer, bringing Mother Superior and 6 other sisters running toward a discovery that would change everything about how they understood their spiritual leader. The priest's body lay crumpled beside St. Sebastian's reliquary, his head bearing injuries consistent with falling against stone edges during cardiac distress. The foxglove's effects had mimicked natural heart failure closely enough to fool casual examination, while the staged fall explained visible trauma without suggesting deliberate violence. Margaret's final performance came in her apparent discovery of Father Dubois's last letter, found clutched in his cooling fingers. The document detailed his concerns about water damage to the relic collection and his determination to protect sacred artifacts, even at personal risk. His handwriting appeared increasingly shaky toward the end, suggesting the cardiac episode had begun while he worked. From the coroner's report, filed June 26, 1807, Father Antoine Dubois died of natural causes exacerbated by accidental trauma. Heart failure precipitated fall, resulting in head injury. No evidence of foul play. Recommend improved lighting in monastery crypt. The investigation concluded within 2 days, helped by the sisters' unified testimony about Father Dubois' dedication to his religious duties and their grief over losing such a devoted spiritual guide. Mother Superior's letters to Bishop Morrison praised the priest's final act of selfless service, ensuring his death would be remembered as martyrdom rather than the consequence of systematic predation. But the sisters' real masterpiece lay in documents that had already begun their journey toward Philadelphia, carrying testimony that would expose the entire network of corruption that had protected Father Dubois and others like him. The package included not just his forced confession, but also letters intercepted from Bishop Morrison's correspondence, financial records showing payments made to silence families of victims, and a detailed map of parishes where similar abuse had been reported, then covered up. Evidence that would reach reformist priests within 2 weeks, sparking investigations that would eventually expose dozens of predatory clergy throughout the frontier regions. Yet even as justice began its slow work through official channels, the sisters faced an unexpected consequence of their carefully planned revenge. News of Father Dubois' death brought immediate attention from church authorities, who wanted to understand how such a valuable priest had died in what should have been a secure religious environment. The replacement priest arrived 13 days after Father Dubois' burial, but Father Michael O'Brien brought more than sacraments to St. Mary's Monastery. His travel papers included authorization for a complete investigation into the circumstances surrounding his predecessor's death, orders that came directly from Bishop Morrison's office, where questions had begun circulating about the frontier parish's unusual mortality rates. The sisters discovered that killing a predator had attracted attention from the predators who'd protected him, turning their triumph into a new kind of danger. Father O'Brien was younger, sharper, trained in seminary investigation techniques that frontier priests rarely possessed. His first act was requesting complete access to monastery records, correspondence, and financial documents dating back 3 years. His second was interviewing each sister individually about their relationship with Father Dubois and their observations about his final days. Margaret faced her interrogation on July 8th, sitting in the same parlor where her father had sold her into religious servitude 18 months earlier. Father O'Brien's questions came with precision that suggested prior knowledge about irregularities in Father Dubois' ministry, though he never specified what information had prompted his investigation. Several sisters mentioned that Father Dubois took particular interest in the younger novices, O'Brien said, his voice carrying sympathy that felt calculated rather than genuine. Did you observe anything unusual about his spiritual counseling methods? The question contained layers of implication that Margaret had to navigate carefully. Admitting knowledge of Father Dubois' abuse would invite questions about why such serious crimes hadn't been reported to higher authorities. Denying awareness would contradict testimony from other sisters who'd already mentioned the priest's inappropriate behavior. Father Dubois was very dedicated to helping young women understand their religious duties, Margaret replied, choosing words that could support multiple interpretations. Some of the newer sisters found his guidance challenging, but spiritual growth often requires difficult lessons. From the investigation notes of Father Michael O'Brien, systematic evasion suggests coordinated response to specific threat. Sisters demonstrate unusual unity in protecting information about deceased priests' activities. Recommend extended investigation with secular authorities. Catherine's interview 3 days later revealed the same pattern of careful testimony that admitted nothing while implying everything. The sisters had rehearsed their responses during evening prayers, developing a narrative that portrayed Father Dubois as demanding but holy, strict but caring, devoted to spiritual welfare even when his methods seemed harsh to those who didn't understand religious discipline. But Father O'Brien had discovered evidence they hadn't anticipated. A letter from Sister Sarah's family, questioning why their daughter had been transferred so suddenly to Louisiana missions without opportunity for farewell visits. The letter described personality changes they'd observed during Sarah's final home visit, behaviors that suggested trauma rather than spiritual growth. Similar correspondence had reached Bishop Morrison from 3 other families whose daughters had passed through St. Mary's during Father Dubois's tenure. Young women who'd left the monastery changed in ways that concerned parents who'd sent faithful daughters for religious education. The investigation began expanding beyond St. Mary's walls. Father O'Brien requisitioned financial records that revealed unusual payments to families of former novices, funds labeled as missionary support, but distributed with timing that corresponded to sudden departures of young women from the monastery. The amounts suggested compensation rather than charitable assistance, payments designed to ensure silence rather than fund religious work. Margaret and Catherine understood their situation was deteriorating, but escape had become impossible. Father O'Brien had requested secular assistance in his investigation, bringing county authorities who lacked religious sensibilities about protecting church reputation. These men cared nothing for institutional preservation and everything for solving puzzles that connected dead priests to missing young women. On July 20th, workers discovered human remains while repairing the monastery's foundation, bones that appeared too recent for the building's normal burial practices. The skeleton showed evidence of trauma inconsistent with natural death, including fractures that suggested violence rather than accident or disease. The discovery transformed Father O'Brien's investigation from administrative inquiry into criminal matter. Sister Bernadette, released from her cell after Father Dubois' death, had begun talking about voices she'd heard during her confinement. Conversations conducted in the crypt during night hours, sounds of digging near the foundation walls, whispered planning sessions between sisters who'd thought themselves unobserved. Her testimony, dismissed earlier as the ravings of an unstable mind, suddenly carried weight that threatened to expose everything. The sisters realized their carefully constructed narrative was collapsing under scrutiny they hadn't anticipated. Father O'Brien's investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic abuse, but it had also revealed patterns of coordination among the sisters that suggested planned response rather than spontaneous grief over their spiritual leader's accidental death. As summer heat intensified and investigation pressure mounted, Margaret and Catherine faced a choice between confession and flight, between justice and survival. They chose a third option that no one had anticipated. But some say that even now, when Kentucky thunderstorms rage across limestone bluffs where St. Mary's once stood, you can still hear voices singing hymns in harmony, too perfect for human throats. Melodies that rise from ground where secrets were buried deeper than bones, carried on wind that remembers everything and forgives nothing. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.